Welcome to the Demonstrating Implementation Excellence stream of Expo 2022. My name's Ian Spires. I'm a terminology education specialist at SNOMED International. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of this presentation. So for those online, please use the Q&A box to type your questions to the presenter. And those on site, I've got a mic that I can distribute to ask questions. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Kate on improving clinician and consumer experience using smart forms, SNOMED and FHIR in action.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. I've done a lot of talking this week, so if my voice goes, forgive me. Let's see how we go. So welcome, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey that we've been on for the last 4 years and the journey that we're going to continue to go on over the next few years, and really talk about what we're trying to do around encouraging clinicians and consumers to improve the data quality, get access to better data through SNOMED and through FHIR. So we established a primary care data quality project over 4 years ago with funding from the Federal Department of Health. And at that time, the Federal Department of Health was looking at what they could do to start to build a primary care data asset for Australia. How could we start to get the richness of the information that's being recorded in primary care? And how could we understand that data at a national level? But the department understood through the little data, we were never actually going to get to our nirvana of big data. And the challenge we had was there were actually no common agreed data definitions within Australia. We had our vendors using different proprietary terminologies. We had lots of different data models. So we had our data requirements and our information models for our National Electronic Health Record. We had different data standards required for reporting. We had different data standards required for communication. And what this was doing was just creating noise and confusion for both the industry and for the clinicians. So we said, if we could actually bring our clinical stakeholders together, the peak bodies, we could bring clinicians, working clinicians in the room, we could bring them together with government agencies and the industry, and let's see if we could define a core common data model for use in primary care. And part of our design principles around this was because we wanted to learn from the movement that was happening with FHIR around the establishment of the community process, was could we actually create an open and transparent community? So I would like to acknowledge there's about 120 people who've been actively working on this project across Australia, from clinical peak bodies, government agencies and software industry, who've been turning up regularly without travel funding, without remuneration, to actually work collaboratively together to achieve this. And we came up with some core principles around it. It was going to be open and transparent. Everything is publicly available. We have a Confluence site. Everyone in this room can get access to that Confluence site and get access to every single thing that has been done throughout this project. We wanted to make sure it was consensus driven, and all you know how hard consensus driven is when we're talking about clinicians and industry and government, but we really wanted to see if we could make sure this was consensus driven. And we also didn't want to let perfect be the enemy of good. We wanted to actually be agile and iterative, keep delivering in stages along the way and keep delivering value in stages along the way. So how do we kind of deal with some of that consensus difficulty? We had a set of core design principles, and we said that what we were after in all of this was looking at how we could enable the single entry of information by the clinicians within their clinical record and support multiple use and reuse of that information within the clinical record, and actually reduce that burden of effort for clinicians where they enter in a problem list, but then they have to transcribe it over into another form for the government and then another data set, and then they do the same with something else. So we said, no, we need to come up with a way to define a data model that says the clinicians, if they enter that information right in the record the first time, sure, they need to maintain it, but they don't have to re-enter it. That information can be reused at the point of care for a primary purpose of information. And importantly, that information can then also be transferred for both local, regional, and national data aggregation. But we weren't just worried about the clinicians with this. We also knew we were creating burden and impost on industry because we kept asking them to implement in different ways with different standards, with different forms. And so we're asking them to also rebuild and build again and build again. So we said, how could we define a process that said to industry, let's start building in some common reusable components that when you build once, you can leverage that for the next implementation. And we can start to actually be much more iterative and much more agile with getting new products out to the market for our clinical audience that are based on standards. And really importantly, it had to be not data for data's sake. All of you know that you get in a room with a group of clinicians and a group of public health researchers, and everyone wants like these massive sets of data information models. But we might need it for this, and we might need, but how do we start to say, what is the core clinical information? What is that core data model that I need for primary use of data in the practice for care? Not driven by a national data spec requirement, but what does the clinician need at the point of care so they can deliver care to their patients? They can manage their community cohort, but that data, of course, can then be reused for national purposes. And so we really started to get down to that debate around, is this needed for you as a clinician or for the next clinician in the care chain or for the consumer to manage their care? That had to be first and foremost how we defined this. And we also were trying to be pragmatic. Again, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. What can systems support now or with minimal effort? So we came up with this approach, and really what we were trying to do was, as I said, reduce effort for the clinicians, for the software industry, improve data that was available at local, regional, and national levels, make sure that we could actually improve the clinical experience. All of us in the room are passionate about SNOMED. We're passionate about quality data. If we are going to get this right, we need to make sure that our software systems have excellent user experience for our clinicians in the way that they access SNOMED. They are our #1 customer first. Let's work with the software vendors because they are the interface between us and the clinical audience and us as the consumer audience as well. So how do we make that? How do we make those systems work well? And we have to do that in partnership with the industry. We wanted to, as I said, support the exchange of information between systems. This wasn't just about getting data right for national use. Interoperability is #1. We want to support the exchange of information between those systems. We want to support better use of data within those systems. How can we drive better clinical decision support? How can we support safer and more accurate extracts? I don't know, in our country, the GP systems had different data models. We had different extract tools that had different data models. And so, this data was munged so many times by the time it gets up to national that I say you're not even comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing apples, oranges, and probably it's a steak. This data is so different. So, how do we improve those data extracts? And how do we trigger good decision support within the system? And at the end of this, we wanted to have a ready-made library of both information models, of value sets, and different reference implementations so industry could actually pick this up and move forward with it. I don't expect you to read it. I know how blurry this screen is at the back of the room. So all of this will be made available. But basically what we did is we took every single existing specification known in Australia and we put it into a really big spreadsheet. And I hate spreadsheets. We put it into a really, really big spreadsheet. And then we actually started to analyze and say, if we're trying to build a common data model, out of all of these specs, what are the fields? What are those data items that keep coming up time and time again? And, we all know them. It's medications, it's adverse reactions, it's problem lists. And so let's start building our common data model around those things that we know that if we get right, that will support 80% of every use case that we can think about. So we did all that and we started to harmonize that content and we got all of our clinicians and industry to agree that this was the core data elements. And then we built a FHIR implementation guide. And so I think one of the things that we did is we're building our information models in CKM, which is an open air clinical knowledge manager. And we wanted to leverage, because, reuse, and that was for us as well, what had been done before us. What were the clinical data models that were already available? So we took what was happening in FHIR, we took what was available in open air, and we built our clinical information model off the basis of that. And then we built our FHIR implementation guide off the basis of that clinical information model. And we created all of the SNOMED CT value sets to bind to that information model. So we now have a primary care common data dictionary. And we have a set of FHIR IGs, and the first FHIR IG we developed was the practice-to-practice record transfer. So how can we get that core information from one GP system to the another GP system? But then our clinicians and our vendors said, that's great, but that might happen really infrequently, that a consumer actually moves from one practice to another. The thing that we do all the time is we do assessment forms, and they're all different, and there's so many of them, and all the data is the same. So how can we start at looking for how we could apply these principles to assessment forms? And in Australia, we have an annual item of care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The clinical audience had just agreed what that information should be in that clinical assessment form. So we thought, this is fantastic. We have the clinical colleges agreeing that this is the information that's required in that annual item of care. Now let's take that annual item of care. Let's ensure that our data model aligns with that, our SNOMED value sets that align with that, and let's build a FHIR implementation guide so that we can start to use FHIR questionnaires to deliver that in each of our vendor applications. And we could start to standardize then the way that clinicians interacted with those questionnaires. Because until this point, this really important annual item of care, annual health check, was done largely in PDF. That's kind of useless. What are we going to do with all this rich clinical data that is now sitting in a PDF form? How am I going to reuse that? How am I going to develop a care plan for that? How am I going to do follow-up care for that? How am I actually going to get all of those annual observations of care around diabetes from that form and actually check how that individual is doing? So we said, how do we turn that into a FHIR questionnaire? How do we put structured data in that? And how do we standardize that across the GP systems? I'm going to run out of time, so I won't go into this, and you can get access to this all through the Confluence site. Is not surprising for those in the audience, our release 1, meds, problem list, procedures, adverse reactions, no brainer. Then we started to look in release 2 around family history, risk factors. And then we started to look for release 3. Really, this is where social care starts to come in, and how do we look at social determinants of health? How do we look at activities of daily living? So as I said, we didn't let perfect be the enemy of good. We said, let's get the core to start with, and then let's keep building, and then make sure that we're looking at those value sets that align to it. And our value sets are maximal value sets. We want these value sets to be relevant, regardless of which GP system, which care setting, because we want to enable interoperability between these care platforms. And I really don't expect you to read this one, but where you see all the green, so down the side, these is all the elements of our information models. So, you know, immunizations, diagnostics, observation data, procedure data. All across the top are all of the different current assessment forms or documents that are currently required to be exchanged between the clinical systems, government, or between states and territories. Where the green is where those data models and those value sets can be reused. And that's what we should be aiming for. How can we actually define this and reuse this so our vendors build once, deploy many, and build on it for the next iteration? And our clinicians can enter that information in the record once, a SNOMED coded problem list in the GP system that gets maintained, and it just has to get maintained. It doesn't then have to get transcribed multiple times over. So as I said, we moved on to the health check project as it was identified as a second use case. And we actually started to define that with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health organisations and with the clinical information system vendors. And part of that was also to develop a strategy and a proposal for national implementation. One of the key things is that the current health check, we did a series of workshops with the Aboriginal community, and the current health check process, as I said, was largely sure, it was in the information system, but it was just like a letter. It was a PDF. There was nothing happening with that data. And then all of that information had to keep getting reused. There was no way that they could provide anything meaningful to the consumers. There was no way that it could support follow-up care within their system. So what we really worked through with them to say, well, what's that future process look like that can support active decision support within the system, that it can actually support better consumer engagement? So how can we now have a process, for example, where the consumer can start to actually complete the health check themselves ahead of the consultation? There's some very sensitive questions around sexual health behaviour and alcohol and substance behaviour. If you know, that could be done in a non-confrontational way in a clinical consult, and you could actually have the consumer start to complete some of that information before, and then that health assessment went into the clinical practice, and then jointly you can go through that. You can start address some of these challenges around how to better engage with the consumer as part of it. A lot of consumers felt like the health check was being done to them rather than with them. So how do we change that behaviour? What came out of those workshops and what the clinicians wanted was a lot of, there's 5 different templates in the health check, depending on the age group. How do we start to make it intelligent and in context? So if we have the demographics, we have the age ranges, we have the postcode in this smart form, this smart questionnaire, we can actually now define that this is the question for this age group. And actually in this postcode, rheumatic heart disease is very prevalent, and therefore there's additional questions that we now need to have it as part of that. So how do we start to make an intelligent smart form? Absolutely, the EMR had to be the source of truth. So how do we pull that data from the EMR that already exists in the EMR and populate it into the form? How do we launch it in context from within the EMR? And how can we integrate decision support as part of the workflow? So one of the key things that has to be done as part of every health check is looking at CVD risk. Now, normally what that requires is the general practitioner to leave their clinical information system, go over to a website or another tool, do the calculation, and then go back into their system, and they have to re-enter all that data again and leave their system. So how can we, as part of this smart questionnaire approach, leveraging the fact that we've got SNOMED behind it and structured data, start to enable this risk calculation score be triggered within the system itself? We really wanted that data to start to write back into the EMR. So we had to have a common data model and common standards for this. And we really want to reuse this data for audit and population health purposes. This can't be, again, the clinicians having to re-enter it. I just put this slide up around, really there's such an interplay of both the use case and FHIR and SNOMED CT that's supporting what we're doing. And the blue doesn't stand out so well, but you know, SNOMED CT is absolutely core to this. But what we're trying to do in this smart form process is leverage SNOMED CT as the true clinical terminology. We're leveraging the FHIR APIs, and that's really that base capability that's supporting access to the structured information model and the terminology. Decision support is part of it. So we're using the FHIR standard CDS hooks as part of that. We really want to be able to launch it with applications. So how do we launch it using the SMART standard, and also FHIR questionnaires? And as part of the FHIR questionnaire standard, there's something called SDC, structured data capture. And that's what supports that pre-population of data and that post-population of data. So really there's such an interplay of all of these standards coming together to really make sure that we can deliver this. And I don't have up there, but I should have up there OpenAir, because we really are leveraging OpenAir, the suite of FHIR standards, and SNOMED and LOINC for observations to actually bring all this together. So the capability that we've developed, and there is a video which I won't play for you, but I'll make sure you have the links, is to be able to use SMART to launch this in every GP system, pre-population of that problem list data, the adverse reaction allergy data over into the SMART form, the meds data. And what it also enables is through this is that, you know, if you want to, you start to complete a health check process and you've got a problem list that you've brought over from your GP system, but you want to add additional problems because you want to update that, then it is also using the FHIR Terminology Services API to call an externalized terminology server to support that really good user interface around smart search for the clinicians. And we've embedded a CVD risk calculator in it with embedding the algorithm into the questionnaire. So this is what our prototype looks like with tabular approach, so that the clinicians, instead of scrolling through what was a very, very long keep scrolling and hope you get to the end of assessment approach, is a tabular approach where they can start to walk through it and enter that information in. As I said, problem list comes across and then you can update that problem list. And then we start to get into a lot of the social determinants around social emotional wellbeing, substance use, etc. in this as well, all of which we're building SNOMED CT value sets to support. I mentioned the CVD risk, and this is one of those things where all the demographic data, gender information, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander status, diabetes, it's recognized that in the person's problem list, diabetes was a problem in their problem list in the record. It's already acknowledged that that's a yes in the assessment, which actually impacts on the algorithm and the individual's risk of it. So it's saying to the clinicians, you're not going over and re-entering anything now. You've just completed your health assessment. I've pre-populated the data in because I've got a SNOMED code sitting behind diabetes, whatever was in that problem list, regardless of how that term was used by the clinician, as long as it's a SNOMED term, that's come across, and then we can present this back to the clinicians as part of the process. How am I going for time?
We got about 5 minutes.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so I'll keep going then. So basically, as I said, we're taking the archetypes, we're building those into templates. We've got governance around the archetypes. We're then taking that logical model over into the FHIR logical model land so that we can embrace the richness of open air, but embrace the pragmatism of FHIR. I want my cake and to eat it too. And so is that an expression that translates? But so we're going to the logical model, and then we're building out the questionnaires, and we also have the data dictionary as an output, and we have the SNOMED CT value sets as an output of that. One of the things is we're not just doing this against the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, because as I said, we want reusability here. We want to not just build one questionnaire and not have anything that we can reuse for the next questionnaire. So if we look at the health check and all of the items that are in the health check, part of the challenge with looking at a single questionnaire definition is, sure, we can just take what's in a paper form and easily render this as a FHIR questionnaire. But what we're doing is we're not having any reuse as part of that. We've done one questionnaire, you've seen one questionnaire, you've seen one questionnaire. What we want to do is start to change that approach. And we're leveraging the great work that Brian Postlethwaite's been doing through the HL7 community, where he's looking at, well, how can we start to take a modular approach to questionnaires? How can we start to make sure that we've got reusable, and I know Peter and Rob, the technical people in the room will kind of, just block your ears, but how can we just take some reusable components? I'm not technical. And how can we take those and reuse those? So every time we've got a question about problem list and what's that person's problem list, instead of every time coming up with a different questionnaire around that, how can we actually have that as a standardized component that can actually be reused across questionnaires? So we start to create that reuse there as well. So if we take something like pulling out the key things around, while this is an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health check, we pull out the key things like client details, health priorities, conditions, medications. I don't think there's anything that anyone would look at that list and not say is common to most kind of health assessments or health checks that you would do across your populations. And so how can we actually start to create those as modules so that we can then start to combine those modules in all the different questionnaires as we start to grow and really try and build that library of information models, library of value sets, and library of questionnaire module components. And then you can say, well, at the government level, well, I'm going to roll out a new policy and a new program. I need a new assessment form for that, or I need a new tool for that. Great. Here's a library that would probably have 90% of every component that you want to pull together to start to build that new template. And then the vendors themselves, well, they've already started to build the building blocks for this. So then they go from a negotiation backwards and forwards with government around this is going to take 2 years to do it, and it's a government priority, so how do we shrink that, to, oh, okay, in 3 months we can actually deploy that and get that out to our systems. And so it really starts to improve in terms of that healthcare delivery, how we can in a much more agile way start to also respond to government priorities as they start to change. So as I said, we're not just doing this for health check, we're also looking at aged care assessment. And gee, if we start to look at that middle blue box around those core components, there are some that start to be the same between the health check for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and the health check for aged care assessment. And as I said, we're doing maximal value sets of SNOMED so that, again, these are reused. We're not creating lots of little different ref sets and subsets that we have to maintain. We're looking at the maximal value sets of SNOMED that bind to the information model that then can be applied in the context of these implementations. So the outcomes we're at, we now have a core data model that we can keep building on. We have these maximal value sets, as I said. Really excitingly, the industry is moving to native adoption of SNOMED CT using FHIR terminology services, because as our industry is moving from the on-prem products to cloud-based software as a service products, it's providing that opportunity for them to rebuild and re-platform to SNOMED. And the easiest way for them to do that is, again, to use the FHIR terminology services standard. It becomes a much easier way for industry to implement. You don't need your vendors to understand anything about RF2 anymore. They can actually start to say, here's how I use this API. I know what value set is bound to the information model. That's what I, as a vendor, need to understand, because the people who know SNOMED and the people who know FHIR have done that work for me. And as an industry person, then I can just implement this. The model is now being explored beyond aged care and primary care to looking at the child health record, not surprisingly, because where does most of the child care get delivered is through the general practice. So how do we, again, start to leverage this approach? What's fabulous is the clinicians are actively asking their vendors for this. So it's not, again, government's not kind of out in front dragging industry along. We've created this a community collaborative process. We've engaged the clinicians, we've engaged industry. They're actually ahead of the policy, and Herbert, who's down back of the room, is as the standards lead within Australia, is able to take advantage of this and then start to work with industry who've already started to choose some of the standards. And, it changes the way of the way that we're working. And standards have now become sexy again in Australia. So, that's really exciting. Interoperability became a bad word. Standards became a bad word. They're starting to get sexy again. People understand the value. So where to next for the project? We're finalising the FHIR implementation guide. As I said, everything's publicly available. We're really going to continue to work on this modular approach to questionnaires, work with the international community around this and really start to drive it. We're developing a production grade open source reference implementation. So we're making it open source, but we do want the vendors, and they want to move quickly. So we're building it at this production grade so that they can actually build it within their product. We said to industry, if you want to do all of this and make this happen, how long will it take? And we natively want to do this, but it might take us 2 years. If you give us a really good reference implementation, we could probably have it deployed in months. So we're making an open source implementation that is a open source Smart on FHIR app that can render any questionnaire IG, because we're going to deploy it and test across multiple projects. Absolutely continuing to work in the HL7 working groups. Now we've been talking to Jane this morning and the work that they're doing around social care within SNOMED, and now we're really keen to be part of that work at the SNOMED international level around how we can bring our social care value set work into play there. And as I said, looking at different use cases, and we have a connectathon scheduled for later this year. Open to anyone. Rob's always amazing. Rob always dials in from the US to our connectathon. So, just because it's in Australia, you can always dial in. So thank you.
So thank you. Okay, I think one of the things that I teased you earlier is I was going to ask you the why question, but I think that presentation really showed the why this needs to be done. We've probably got time for one question. It'll have to be quick. So does anybody have any questions? Oh, I'm sure Kate would be happy to talk to you after this session. No? So thank you, Kate.
My pleasure.